Hi, welcome to Sensory Explained Simply. I'm Trish Roberts. Thank you so much for investing in this important and informative video. The first thing I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about myself. I'm an occupational therapist, and I've been a pediatric occupational therapist for about 20 years now. And in that time, I've had the wonderful opportunity to work with hundreds of children with sensory processing disorder and children who have sensory difficulties related to autism spectrum disorder. And what I found through my practice is that parents really need more information, and not just parents, teachers, family, anyone who works with a child who has sensory difficulties, and really any child. It's important that they understand how those kiddos work. And sensory processing is a huge foundation to their functioning. And so with all that misunderstanding out there, I really just wanted to create a video that helped people understand the sensory systems, how they work, and how they help a child function. And when a child has sensory difficulties, what they can do to help alleviate those difficulties so that the child functions better. The first thing I want to do is explain the role of an occupational therapist, because I think that's really important in understanding what we do and also understanding how a child develops skill. As an occupational therapist, I'm looking at children and really any human in terms of their occupational functioning. And that means what you do every day. That is your curriculum for life, let's say. And so for a child, their curriculum is play and interactions with their environment and the people in their environment. And that occupation is what creates opportunities for them to develop skill. And not just develop it, but refine it, practice it, modify it, do all sorts of things, and ultimately learn from it and function from it. So when you're looking at a child, you're really looking at how they play. And what they're doing and how they're doing it really does shape their development. And the best example I like to give is what makes a football player look like a football player and a ballerina look like a ballerina. What you do actually guides how you develop. So for a little one, for a child, we're looking at, is the function of their play and what they do every day serving them in developing skill and being able to do what they need to do, because that's what they're going to use to learn and function and thrive. So what we first need to look at is how they do those things. So when you're looking at children, they are using movement. That is their primary vehicle for this interaction in their environment. And you have to remember that when they're born, that little brain of theirs is empty, and through every experience they have with people and items in their environment, interactions they have in their environment, they are creating and filling their brain with this inventory of experience. And how they do that is via their sensory systems. You want to think of the sensory systems as this huge network or web. I kind of equate it to the internet that is feeding the child's brain. And it's feeding it via different sensory channels, what they're seeing, how they're moving, what they're tasting, what they're hearing. All of those things are integrated. That's why it's called sensory integration. They all work together to help the child experience and modify what they're participating in their environment. So when we look at kiddos who have a sensory processing difficulty, we need to look at ways to help them so they're interpreting this information better. And when we talk about the sensory systems, I'm going to go through them just briefly because there's a lot of misunderstanding in regard to the sensory systems. Everyone is familiar with our senses, what you're seeing, smelling, tasting, and how that provides information. But what you need to think of is there are more than just those senses. There are other senses that deal with movement, that deal with quality of movement, position sense, and that is really critical to a child being able to use their body as a tool and use it in relation to things in their environment. So I'm going to go through those briefly. The first one is your position sense. and those are called proprioceptors, and those are located in your joints and muscle bellies throughout your body. And what that does is it deals with how the body is positioned and helps your brain know where the body is at all times. So in other words, I'm sitting here now, no one needs to take a videotape of me or a picture to tell me that my knees are bent or that my hands are folded. My brain always knows where my body is, and it's because the proprioceptors are telling it the position sense. All right, the next channel is the vestibular channel, which is a sensory system that is hard for people to understand, but the vestibular channel is located in your inner ear, and it deals with a lot of head positioning, head writing in relation to movement. And that's the system that you're really feeling when you're swinging, when you're on a roller coaster ride. It really helps the kind of interpret a lot of movement and helps the head to write in relation to that movement. And so that's why when a child, one reason that they run and jump and play and do all of those things is because they really need a lot of input to that vestibular, all the sensory systems, but especially that to help it develop, to help it understand movement, to help it process and really get strong with quickly interpreting that movement and what it needs to do in terms of response to it. The next one I want to talk about is kinesthesia, and that's not a familiar sensory system, but a critical sensory system, and that deals with your movement sense. That's how you grade movement, how you interpret movement. That impacts the quality of the movement. And so that's your body's ability to use these sensory systems and feel and react. So that's where you'll see kiddos who are doing a lot of like really intense movement that's disproportionate with the activity, where they're maybe, really hitting things hard, or when they're writing, let's say they barely put any pressure on it. That's because they don't have a good sense of their kinesthesia and the quality of their movement. That's also kiddos that have a hard time in terms of coordination and, like I said, grading movement in relation to others, things like that. So then I'll briefly go into the other sensory systems that you're more familiar with. The first one is oral sensory, and that's one that we don't really think too much about, but it's really a highly sensitive, very stimulating channel and it's the first one to develop. That's where the children are using everything in their mouths, but for all of us, this is a hugely sensitive area. And so we use it a lot for comfort. And obviously, we're designed to use it that way, so we ensure that we're fed. It also, for a young child, really yields a lot of information, because when the other systems aren't as highly developed, they're going to go to their mouth. So that's why you see like a young child putting lots of things in their mouth or tasting lots of things. And that's just because that's their most effective way of getting sensory input, because their arms don't work well, because their vision's not so great. So what happens is when your child has a sensory difficulty, they often revert back to more effective ways of getting input. So that's why you're seeing these little cuties who are constantly putting input in their, putting things in their mouth for that input. And even older children, they're chewing on their pencils, they're chewing on their shirt, they're, constantly using that mouth. And that's just indicative of that nervous system needs more input, and they're getting it orally because it is the most effective for them still, and the most comforting. All right, the next sensory channel is called the ocular motor channel, or the visual channel. But what that looks at is not so much how well the child sees, that's called acuity. We're actually looking, when we look at this channel, is how the child responds to visual stimulation. You have to remember, in their environment, there is so much going on visually that they're needing to respond to, and it deals with how well they respond to that and how well their eyes move in relation to it. So that looks at tracking and quick localization, which is your ability to look at something, and if I hear something over here, quickly cast my gaze that way. That for children not only can be difficult, and that's where you'll see children who have limited eye contact. They have limited eye contact because they're having a hard time processing that visual input. One, in terms of speed and fluency in response to it, but also in terms of the volume of visual input. You have to remember, children are constantly what they call modulating, and that's how you kind of regulate the volume of input. And so for kiddos who have a hard time visually tolerating that input, or if they aren't processing it well, if it's somewhat confusing to them, as a protective mechanism, they will cast their eyes away. And that's why they very oftentimes have limited eye contact. It's just a way for them to kind of reduce that volume of visual information in their environment. All right, olfactory, that's your sense of smell. That's what obviously is helping you label and build that inventory that I talked about earlier. That's looking at when they're smelling, they're just helping label things in terms of, oh, I smell a chocolate chip cookie, or oh, that is, my mom's perfume, or my formula, and various other things in the environment. Right away when you walk in somebody's house, oh, I smell cookies baking, things like that. So it helps you label. It's also protective in the sense of if something does not smell good, it's your way of avoiding it. And so children who have a sensitivity to sensory input very often have a hard time with smells. And that's when you'll see them kind of cover their face up, or it really is just too much for them. All right. We'll talk auditory next. That's the next channel. You're very familiar with that. It's everything you're hearing, and you need to respond to that. Again, it's helping them label and identify things in their environment. That's a train coming. That's my mom's voice. They're also responding to volume of auditory information. So it helps them know when something is close or if something's far, or it helps them know, ooh, mom might be angry, her voice is loud, her voice is angry, all sorts of things like that. Again, children with sensory difficulties, they have a hard time with that. So they're either going to be kind of covering up because it's too much for them, or they have what's called like a hypersensitive sense of, hearing. And that's when things that you won't register, they'll hear like a train in the distance, or they will hear the heater, or things that their brain really should be able to kind of filter out. They have a hard time doing that. They also have a hard time sometimes when you talk about low registration kiddos. Those are kiddos that don't respond well to input. They need a lot of input. Those are kiddos who are very often not going to be responding to auditory things in their environment. You calling their name, various things like that. All right, the next one we're going to talk about is tactile. That's your skin sense. And that's really everything that you're feeling. The child is building information, building that inventory, and they know what things are. So with that, you're tolerating clothing textures, you're tolerating temperature, you're tolerating sticky media, all sorts of different things in your environment, grass. It's helping your brain, again, understand the physical aspects in your environment and your relation to those physical aspects. It's also protecting. If something's hot, ooh, you're going to pull away. If something's sharp, those type things. A lot of kiddos with sensory problems, as you know, if you have one, they have a very difficult time tolerating those sensory textures. So they're going to be the ones that have a sensitivity to layers of clothing, tags in their clothing, different sticky things, need their hands washed right away, those kinds of things. All right, so now that we've gotten through all the sensory channels, I want to explain how that impacts the child's functioning. What does it mean for them? And one of the biggest questions that I've been asked time and time again speaks to this misconception that sensory activities are separate from other activities. And what I want to really get across is that they're integrated. There's nothing the child does that they aren't processing this sensory input. And so if we want them to function better, we really need to have a better perspective on how their sensory systems are processing. And so the first thing I'm going to talk about is, one, you need to remember that motor and sensory dovetail. Motor is where the child's really going to get the most out of their sensory systems. So I'll give you a couple examples. If a child is running at the playground, running, sliding, swinging, jumping, doing all of those things, it's a very different, more intense sensory experience than them playing on their iPad. And so what you want to do is, if you want the sensory systems to function better, you really need to stimulate and strengthen them within that child's tolerance. And so for sensory kiddos and any child, you want them in this mid-range. That's where all the sensory systems are functioning well, they're contributing their individual components, and they're communicating well with the other sensory systems. And so if they're in this mid-range, that's when the most learning is going to occur, the best functioning. And so that's where I speak to really having a better understanding of how your child's sensory systems are functioning. Because if you can see that, ooh, we're either getting overstimulated by activity, or ooh, this activity is not stimulating enough, it certainly is going to impact their ability to learn the most that they can. And so what I want to talk about in terms of helping with that is understanding if your child is overly stimulated, then they are too overwhelmed to learn. And that's children who are having a meltdown, that's children who are covering their ears, or who can't tolerate the sensory experience that you're doing, you know, be it shaving cream, glue, those kinds of things, can't tolerate the fine motor. They're overly sensitive to those. Then there are children who are under responsive. Those are kiddos who aren't responding to calling their name. They seem a little sleepy for lack of a better word. They're a little sluggish is what I actually wanted to say. And those are kiddos where a lot of information is kind of blowing past them, and you want them to be catching everything they can. So what you do then is you are working, if the child's overstimulated, you're trying to bring them down by reducing the amount of stimulation in their environment. If a child's understimulated, then you want to be adding some stimulation, because what you want to think of with the sensory system is that is how the child functions, this amazing flow of information through their nervous system. And the nervous system requires a huge volume of input. And so if it's not getting enough, it will seek it out. I like to equate it to hunger. When you're hungry, you will get food. And so if you're keeping a consistent kind of balanced diet, then you're getting this nice nutritional consistency that's feeding your system. Same thing with the sensory systems. The nervous system requires a lot of input so it can develop and strengthen and function. And that's why children have this huge activity level. And if they're responding well, boom, it keeps them in the mid-range. If they're not, the nervous system is agitated and hungry, and that's when the child is doing all sorts of stimming behaviors, or they're running around nonstop, or everything's in their mouth. It's indicative that that sensory system is not getting the volume of information. So then you would want to supplement that. And that's when you're looking at, oh, I know at this time of day, we need to take a walk outside, or we need to go to the park. We need to do some swinging, because once you give that intense kind of gross motor sensory input, then you'll see some of those behaviors fade, and it's going to bring them in that mid-range where they're really functioning well. Another thing you want to remember is they're always processing this sensory input. It tells them what the environment is expecting of them. And I'll give you some examples. When someone smiles at you, you reciprocally smile back. Or with objects in their environment, they understand based on their sensory experiences how to manipulate those objects. So in other words, if it's something cuddly, they're going to cuddle it. Or they point to things in their environment. It doesn't do me any good to point to this water bottle. That's not going to help me open it. I need to know, oh, this is how you open it, and oh, there's a cap here. I've seen this before, and they open it up. It also helps them understand objects without you having to teach them everything in the world. Once you've played with a ball, you know how to play with all sorts of balls and make those modifications that you need to make based on size, speed, all of those things. That's where the sensory systems are helping them function. The one thing you want to keep in mind is that with sensory, you want to be using it intermittently with what they're doing. So in other words, I see a lot of parents, their mindset is, oh, if some is good, more is better. So we're going to run and jump and play, and you need to remember that may very well overstimulate the child. And so what you want to be doing, I'm going to give a fine motor task as an example, or even some homework tasks. You're going to do a little bit of the activity, and then you're going to provide them with an opportunity to get some sensory input. So you maybe give them something for their mouth, a Skittle, something sour, crunchy pretzels. That's feeding their nervous system and actually brings them in that mid-range. It helps them function. Or they do a little bit of their homework and then they go jump on the trampoline. Or even before you start their homework, or before you start a challenging fine motor activity for some of these kiddos who really hate coloring, puzzles, all of that kind of thing. You're going to be wanting, maybe you do a little input on a therapy ball, or you start at the park before you even come in to do that activity. You want to feed that nervous system this nice sensory input because that's what's going to allow the functioning. So when you ask for activities, there are a multitude of activities out there, but what you really want to be doing is using activity and understanding the activity that you're doing so that you can really be maximizing that sensory processing, because that's when it's really going to snowball. Once the sensory systems, I always give the example that if you can strengthen a muscle with exercise, you strengthen the sensory systems with stimulation. And so as long as you're keeping that sensory stimulation in this mid-range so they can learn from it, they're not overstimulated by it, they're not craving it, then you're really going to help those sensory systems process better, strengthen, become more efficient. So I hope this has been helpful. I really do encourage you, work with your occupational therapist, work with your school team, but you need to remember that you're guiding your child's functioning. You need to be their best advocate, and you really do have all the tools to help maximize their play, learning, sensory strategies. You just want to be mindful of how those systems work.